Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Dani and you're watching Daily Debrief. Several big questions for our reporters and guests today, including why is Australia's Prime Minister desperately seeking a meeting with China? What does the WHO's report on global vaccine markets tell us about how so-called free market economics is killing people? And what will be the impact of India's Supreme Court decision to uphold a new category of reservation in public jobs and education? First up, after years of diplomatic strife between Australia and its largest trading partner, China, there is finally indication that the Anthony Albanese-led Labour government might look at dialogue instead of provocation as the way to better bilateral as well as regional relations in the future. The new Australian Prime Minister said nothing was fixed, but that he hoped to meet with President Xi Jinping at the East Asia Summit that is underway today. No Australian leader has met the Chinese president since 2019. But in August this year, after Labour Party swept Australia's elections, the Chinese ambassador there suggested a possible reset of the relationship and unconditional dialogue with the present regime. Anish covers the region for People's Dispatch and spoke to us for more via video conference earlier. Anish, good to see you. Like I was just saying, China sort of opened the door towards this reset or the resumption of dialogue at the highest level between the two countries. China, of course, also Australia's biggest trading partner. How much of a shift is this from what we heard from Albanese soon after coming into power, where the language was still very much in the context of what the US wanted to happen in the region, and perhaps not so much dependent on bilateral ties?
I mean, definitely Australia has, and this is a continuation of what happened in the previous conservative liberal national coalitions, where Australia has taken a very strongly pro-US stand in most of the things, even in many cases at the detriment of its own national interest. Now, one of the things that we recently heard about is how Australia has reaffirmed its conviction to protect Taiwan with the United States, as they say. Now, the problem is that obviously Australia is one of those countries that very strongly follows the one China policy, and if they are going to take a stand that is a problematic stand, actually, that challenges the sovereignty of China, then definitely they are opening up, being part of this whole encirclement policy that we have been seeing for more than 2 years now, more than 2 years actually. And so we need to wait and see, but definitely a whole host of bilateral issues will be at the center of the talks. Obviously, US interests are in many ways, reiterating US interests in many ways is just political grandstanding. In many cases, Australia's bargaining chips are very low compared in the bilateral relations that it has with China, especially with China blocking and taxing or even outright putting sanctions on a whole host of Australian products, goods and services that it really depends on when it comes to its international trade and all of that. So definitely it wants a more positive result from China, and there will definitely be talks based on that rather than what a whole lot of people think would be, which includes Taiwan or other geopolitical situations where Australia doesn't have much of skin in the game to begin with in many of these matters.
All right. Going a bit wider from there, Anish, to the overall summit that's taking place, what are the other interesting sort of storylines that may emerge from the meetings?
So definitely the two summits that are happening, one is the East Asian Summit and the other, the ASEAN Summit, in Phnom Penh, will definitely have China as a major partner in many of these dialogues and issues that will be raised in that. In both these cases, obviously, a whole host of countries are going to also push for bilateral talks, if not right now, but maybe later in the coming months, because obviously, with the whole tensions rising in East Asian region, there needs to be security and steadiness that and stability that many countries, especially smaller countries, want when it comes to trade and other sort of bilateral relationships. And that is something that they need to really talk it out with China, even while they have whatever relationships they have with the United States. So these things will happen. We definitely going to see the Biden Xi meeting next week in Bali with the G20 summit happening. So that definitely can have a positive impact if leaders are pragmatic, especially the United States, which needs to understand that maintaining the status quo is one of the main reasons why the East Asian region has been war-free and free of armed conflicts for more than half a century, actually. If respecting national sovereignty and questions of national sovereignty that really needs to be dealt with by the nations concerned rather than its own interest in the region, would actually make a different kind of tangent that could be beneficial for the US in the long run, considering its own problems with supply chains that it is, it has created on its own. On the other hand, there are obviously, as I said, local, regional issues that really use multilateral issues. Again, US is trying to take a more keen interest in many of these matters, but obviously, US has to play a third fiddle or no role at all in many of these conflicts if it doesn't want to complicate the matters.
Thanks very much. Like you pointed out, Anish, an interesting few days coming up in terms of international diplomacy, and we will, of course, keep you abreast or in tune with how things go down, particularly after that meeting between Biden and Xi in Bali. Thanks again, Anish. The right to health includes the right to vaccines, is the stance of Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the head of the World Health Organization, as it released a first report on the global vaccine market since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Limited supply and unequal vaccine distribution means that lower income countries consistently struggle to access essential inoculations in demand by wealthier nations. This is the most stark conclusion of a report that also highlights the many ways in which market forces prove antithetical to the state of global public health. Jyotsna Singh of the People's Health Movement has more on this report. Welcome back to the show, Jyotsna, and thanks for your time today. A positive report by most accounts. What are your key takeaways from your reading of it?
I think, WHO has been able to capture what the journalists and the civil society and activists have been saying actually since the start of the pandemic, and actually even before that, but more vociferously during the pandemic. That the business as usual approach in pharmaceuticals does not work. Our vaccine market, as the report also says, is actually determined by free market, by the logic of the free market, where the commercial interests actually supersede public health and people's lives, right? So therefore, you see the acute inequity that exists in the entire research and development to manufacturing to supply chain. And I think the worst effect was felt in a very short period during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as in People's Dispatch, we have reported again and again that Africa as a continent was at the worst receiving end of it. Again, which the report also points towards.
Right.
That is because 90% of Africa's vaccines actually come from other sources. They are not manufactured in Africa. And the reason is you have barriers at the level of intellectual property. The technological know-how is not shared with the companies who would be willing to produce vaccines which are otherwise patented by the big pharmaceutical companies. So all of that happens, and then you do not have actually vaccines being supplied to countries like Africa. But it also is not only about COVID-19. It is talking about the past few decades of the whole vaccine supply chain, which reaffirms these ideas. So there are two things when we talk about this commercial interest guiding the whole vaccine supply chain, which is when the high income countries need vaccines, even if they are needed by the low income countries, as happened in COVID-19 exactly, then all the vaccines are taken away by the rich nations, and poor nations have no access to it. On the other hand, there are certain diseases like cholera, smallpox, Ebola, which affect primarily the poorer nations. And these are outbreaks. So you need these vaccines only when the
quickly.
outbreak happens.
Yeah.
So you do not have any market incentive to produce. So you have a lack of R&D for these vaccines, or they are not available when needed. And people, again, in that scenario, also in the poor countries, continue to die. So we need a complete overhaul of the existing system. And as I began with, the business as usual approach, and the report has been able to actually point towards all of that. So it is a reaffirmation. Yeah.
And some recommendations therein also. But Jyotsna, because we are sort of short on time, you were pointing us in the direction of an investigation that actually shows the role that Big Pharma played. And because the idea of intellectual property is so critical in all of this, and therefore Big Pharma's role in it. Tell us a little bit about this new report that's come out and what that really tells us in sort of absolute terms about what is going on in this regard.
Absolutely. I think this report has to be read with this new investigative report from the Bureau of Investigative Journalists that has come out. And it shows that how the Big Pharma lobbied and made calls and had meetings with the countries and pressurized them to not take a position in favor of TRIPS waiver, something, a proposal at the WTO, which was calling for suspension of all intellectual property for COVID-19. And it actually mentions that the Belgian government was pressurized, the Colombian and the Mexican governments were pressurized. And if you see, Colombia and Mexico actually took a position very late in favor of TRIPS waiver, even though they are developing countries. They needed the vaccines immediately, and the lobbies from Johnson and Johnson and other big companies actually talked to them, saying that we won't give you the vaccines unless you refuse to favor the TRIPS waiver. So we see, so it is there is a report, and we can say it is a decent report in one sense, though it does not actually attack the most problematic root causes of it, but still it has good analysis. But in the light of this investigation also, the point is, what is the practical solution that the global leaders can give so that we do not have such a dismal situation when it comes to vaccines? We are talking about cervical cancer vaccines. Only 41% of low-income countries have approved it. Even and 83% of rich nations have approved. So there is a huge inequality. The most of the women who die of cervical cancer are actually in the low-income countries, and they don't have access to that vaccine. So we have to see, WHO is also discussing with the countries about a pandemic preparedness mechanism. So we hope that their own report, plus this investigation, plus a lot of work that has been done around the pandemics in the last 2 years, they are able to take into consideration and really, as I said, overhaul the whole system and tell the big pharma that you cannot keep doing what you are doing. It is the public procurement, it is the public manufacturing, public production of the vaccines that we need, and that has to be done as soon as possible. There is no other way out.
Thank you very much. Very concise sort of summary of the entire report, and of course that is available for those who are interested to take a look at. But thanks again, Jyotsna, for your time today. And finally, this week, a 5-judge bench of India's Supreme Court has upheld the 103rd Amendment, which introduces 10% reservation in public jobs and educational institutions based on economic criteria to the so-called economically weaker sections. The decision upends the very structure of affirmative action in India and the many decades of work it has taken to get there. The structure was based on caste, an oppressive social order that creates a hierarchy of communities based on their traditional occupations. There is now an income limit for this EWS reservation. However, it is so high that a large segment of India's population can now be considered poor. Those belonging to historically oppressed classes, therefore, who have access to caste-based reservation, will now be unable to access the reservation for poor. This decision has led to massive debate in the country, and Pragya from NewsClick is here to help us figure out both sides of those arguments, or at least how we're reading it. Pragya, first up, how does this, like we said, fundamentally change the way in which affirmative action was so far structured in India?
Yeah, Siddhant, so the thing is that India has been giving reservations, which is our way of giving affirmative action, since before independence. There was a princely states which started with this practice of reserving a certain number of jobs or places in education institutions or both for the historically marginalized groups. Now, what the Supreme Court has upheld is a 2019 government decision, which was to give reservations on the basis of income. They created a new category called the economically weaker section. They said that those who earn less than rupees 8 lakh a year, which is roughly between $9,000 and $10,000 a year, would be considered as poor. So it's important to sort of know the history of reservations in India, primarily to understand why a section of people is actually upset with this economic criteria. So the reservation was given so far to three categories of people. The former untouchables who were marginalized and oppressed on the basis of their identity at birth. Then there was a scheduled tribe, which was basically based on remoteness and certain developmental indicators.
Right.
And in the later years, we included a category in the constitution which was for the socially and economically backward classes. But these classes we identified on the basis of caste.
Right.
Now, the socially and economically backward classes had actually an exclusion in it, which means that those who were rich among those who were considered rich, there was a cutoff, were not given this reservation. So now we have a new category of economically weaker section, which is not actually a class of people or a caste of people or a section of people who belong in any particular area or region, which leads to or relates to their historical deprivation, oppression, suppression, or exclusion. None of these things which actually make people poor in India apply to this, because poverty is in itself, poverty is transient. And that is why primarily people are upset. But the Supreme Court has decided that this does not violate the Constitution. It has also agreed to giving a 10% quota to the economically weaker sections in excess of the reservation, which was already provided, that is 50%. The Supreme Court itself has passed numerous orders which say that 50% is the limit beyond which reservation will not be allowed to go. But now we find that the economically weaker sections will get reservation. And for all these reasons, it's creating quite a stir.
Right. Apart from the, of course, practical considerations like you were mentioning in terms of the implementation of this extra 10% in terms of having reserved seats in all these institutions as well as undertakings, companies, etc. What will be the impact, particularly from the point of view of those most marginalized classes, of the introduction of a new section of...
Well, I mean, at first glance, it would appear that it will create a sort of sense of conflict between these two sets of, categories which have been created, for the simple reason that there was no survey or methodical scientific study of who is poor. So the government said that this $9,000 to $10,000 a year income limit would have to suffice to determine who is poor. However, there are other schemes and policies of the central government and the various provincial governments which have a much lower
cap,
a $2,500 limit on defining people as poor. So this is one straight off conflict. Now the second thing is, if the government went in 2019, if it had lowered the limit below rupees 8 lakh or between $9,000 and $10,000 a year, then the suspicion it is arousing is that it would have excluded most of those people who were not historically marginalized. Because there are studies, the very detailed studies, which become the basis to give reservation to anybody else, right? And those studies show that poverty and caste go hand in hand in India. So there is this immediate conflict. And secondly, and thirdly, it's also very clear that the Supreme Court, in its observations, has batted against the practice of reservation altogether, which means that they're, in a sense, saying that the way India practices affirmative action should not be done. Now, that has also upset a lot of people, and they're
problematic.
Yeah, they're saying that, why is it that while giving reservation, you are also batting against the whole idea of reservations.
All right. Thank you very much, Pragya, for trying to at least give us a good sense of what is an extremely complex issue, particularly for our international audience. That's all we have on this episode of the show. From Pragya, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, thank you very much for watching. As always, we encourage you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all the other work we do. Also, don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back with a week-ending episode tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, goodbye.